Good morning or good afternoon from wherever across the nation you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us for the Heat Beneath Our Feet webinar, a webinar series that will accompany this year's WGA Chairman Initiative selected by Colorado Governor Jared Polis to explore the development and deployment of geothermal energy. My name is Stephen Emmon. I'm the Energy Policy Advisor for Western Governors Association. Since the beginning of this initiative, WGA has traveled throughout the West, touring multiple geothermal projects and conducting workshops. A general sentiment that I've heard throughout all our travels has been incentive parity. Simply put, participants think that geothermal hasn't got the same look that other resources like wind, solar, and fossil fuels has received. This isn't to say that all resources are the same or geothermal has been ignored, but some other resources have had decades of development encouraged through grants, permitting reform, and research and development. While admittedly, geothermal is kind of having a moment on the national stage right now, it is important for us to consider the lessons learned from other sectors to help us bring geothermal incentives into parity. On today's webinar, we'll be discussing current programs at the federal level, hear about efforts in Colorado to encourage geothermal development, and discuss next steps for geothermal incentives. We're joined by several great guests today, the first being Bryce Carter, the Geothermal Emerging Markets Program Manager for the Colorado Energy Office, Sean Porse, the Data Modeling and Analysis Lead for the DOE Geothermal Technology Office, and Landon Stevens, the Senior Program Director for the Electricity Sector from ClearPath Foundation. Before going any further, I'd like to take a moment to recognize our sponsors who are listed at the beginning of this webinar. Their support is making our work on this initiative possible. A couple housekeeping items. Throughout the webinar, if you would like to ask questions, please submit them in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. After presentations from our participants, we'll have a Q&A section where I'll ask those questions. If you'd like to go back and rewatch any of what we discussed today, this webinar will be posted to the WGA website and social media for viewing at a later time. To kick off this discussion, I'll be handing the mic over to Sean Porse to tell us a little bit more about the Geothermal Technology Office's work on geothermal energy. Sean, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Steve, very much. I'll share my screen. And off we go. So thanks to the organizers for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about sort of the exciting work happening at the federal policy incentive level for geothermal, as well as some of the initiatives that GTO, the Geothermal Technologies Office, is explicitly supporting to support more deployment of geothermal across all use spectrums across the US. There we go. So we know geothermal is the heat beneath our feet. It is the name of the webinar series we are all participating in. It is a wonderful opportunity to tackle things from an electricity side for decarbonization and for heating and cooling. Our 2019 GeoVision demonstrated very clearly that the right alignment of technology innovation, market and policy incentives, as well as consumer adoption and awareness could basically build out in excess of 60 gigawatts of electricity generation from geothermal by 2050 in the US, as well as the installation of 28 million heat pumps, geothermal heat pumps across the US, as well as 17,500 district heating systems. And to pause on that for a moment, not only does that offer vast opportunities for emissions reductions to meet our decarbonization goals as a society, it offers clean jobs, it offers local benefits, it offers an enormous opportunity to provide local and regional benefits by the use of geothermal and deploying this technology. We were excited to announce last September, the Secretary of Energy announced our enhanced geothermal shots, which is an updated set of assessments and assumptions based on our 2019 GeoVision report, but taking a step further, understanding that there have been technology innovations that we have undertaken since 2019 through wonderful work at projects like Forge, as well as other EGS-based programs that demonstrate that with EGS, if we align ourselves and aim for a 90% reduction in the target for developing EGS resources, so meeting a $45 per megawatt hour basis by 2035, by 2050, we will be unlocking in excess of 90 gigawatts of geothermal capacity, inclusive of EGS, hydrothermal, and other traditional power generation resources in geothermal. So everything you see here in blue on the screen in that gradational, the darker the blue, the higher the capacity expansion. It's important to note that much of the Western US, of course, is included in this. But in addition, we have parts of the Southwest and portions of the Mid-Atlantic playing a role in the power sector side of geothermal by 2050, which is a really exciting. We know that this offers a number of opportunities to develop. Ultimately, the way we execute in our programs here in GTO to support things like the enhanced geothermal shot is through the programs we have on our screen: the Enhanced Geothermal Systems Program, Hydrothermal Resources, Low Temp and Co-Produce Resources, as well as Data Modeling Analysis, which is the program that I run. Ultimately, we are a very collaborative office. We think of the challenges and opportunities we focus on holistically. There are shared benefits, for example, from the decades of research that our hydrothermal program has focused on in the drilling innovation space that are directly providing benefits to advancements in drilling at Forge and other EGS demonstration sites. In addition, the exploration innovations that Forge has brought forward from a development space has been directly beneficial to building out hydrothermal resource exploration programs across the Western US. So it is really symbiotic the way we think about how to build all these programs. And the important part is that we are expanding the opportunity for all geothermal resource development. Our enacted budget in 2023 is $118 million. And that obviously continues a very positive trend for us in an increasing year-over-year budget proposal to sort of advance geothermal research. So before I kind of go into the current federal landscape, it's probably important to talk a little bit about what Steve had alluded to, which is how has geothermal been treated from an incentive standpoint in the past. What we see here on the screen is in the top part, we have in the orange line denotes sort of federal funding available from a research standpoint for geothermal, largely through offices like GTO, but also legacy program offices starting back in the 1970s when geothermal research was initiated under the Department of Energy. But as well as the presence or absence of the ITC, the investment tax credit, the PTC, the production tax credit, or the 1603 cash grant that was a brief period of time available during the Recovery Act era. And that's shown in the bar on the bottom. There's a couple of things I want to point out. There's a general positive correlation between high watermarks of geothermal program office funding from a research standpoint and deployment of geothermal resources from the power side on a 3 to 5 year basis after that high watermark. And that would make sense if we think about how long it takes to explore, forward, develop, and build out geothermal power plants. There is also some positive correlation between the presence of the ITC, the benefit that as a tax incentive this has for geothermal, as well as any other renewable energy developers, as was the original mission of those incentive programs. However, the major challenge that geothermal has traditionally had, among others, is the fact that the ITC and the PTC have been renewed in fits and starts over the decades that they have been available. And as a consequence, long lead development of projects that like geothermal, which require 3, 5, or even longer amounts of years, as well as funding, equity, and debt sort of understandings, and from a financial standpoint, it requires a level of certainty that unfortunately a 1 to 2 year availability window for an ITC or a PTC does not provide certainty to developers. So that has hampered the development and full opportunity to take advantage of these offers from the federal side traditionally. The good news is that I think the landscape is changing in a positive way, and that has started with the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, otherwise known as IRA. So the IRA does re-up both the ITC as well as the PTC, and they are available for geothermal in the descriptors here on the screen. So originally the ITC was set to expire, I believe, at the end of 2023. It has been extended for another 2 years. Geothermal is offered at a base ITC amount of 6%. The production tax credit, the PTC, is also available for geothermal right now for developers. And it offers a 3 cent per, I believe, kilowatt, not kilowatt hour, for renewable electricity generating projects, including geothermal, for those that are beginning construction on or before the 1st of January 2025. Importantly, these are both available for 10 years after that either construction initiates or the production initiates. Important to note, though, in addition to those sort of base level credits, there are stackable ways to take advantage of the opportunities that the ITC and the PTC, as enacted in the IRA, are offering. If your project meets regional prevailing wage and registered apprenticeship requirements, if it meets certain domestic content requirements for the materials used in that project, so the steel, the iron, or the manufactured products used in that geothermal development, or if they're located in and around an energy community. An energy community is defined as those that sort of are traditionally have been sort of reliant on fossil energy resources and may have high rates of unemployment. So if you're focusing any number of your projects on meeting these criteria, they are not only stackable, but they are combinable. So you can maximize your tax credit by sort of taking these on. I think one more important thing to note here is that for the PTC, we will be at the federal level, it's going to be shifting to a technology neutral tax credit beyond 2024. So the program will ultimately phase out if by 2032, or if we meet a 25% emissions reduction by 2022 emissions or lower. I can't speak to the impact, right, about what a technology neutral versus a geothermal specific PTC will mean. But I do think it's important to note that we as an audience here, we in the GTO, as long as we are very much pushing for awareness of geothermal's value assets to a rapidly decarbonizing economy and broader energy system, as long as we are identifying the parity and the interest that we know we can contribute with our other renewable energy technologies, I think we will still have a lot of room for opportunity to take advantage of the PTC as a framework, even under a technology neutral spectrum. The good news is that for heating and cooling as well, the IRA does offer pretty significant benefits for consumers interested in, for example, geothermal heat pumps. It offers a 30% tax credit up to $2,000. So it's beyond the normal $1,200 cap that is normally found in the tax code for a purchase of a geothermal heat pump. Additionally, there is a section of the IRA that talks about the Home Energy Rebates Program, which is an $8.8 billion rebate program being designed and will be ultimately implemented and dispersed by colleagues of mine here in the department out to state energy offices across the United States. And this will be for the benefit of developing rebate programs for home energy efficiency, as well as electrification projects, and heat pumps will likely be a part of that process. My colleagues here in DOE are working really hard to get that money out the door. They are also working very hard to make sure that it is informative to the community and beneficial from an implementation basis. So stay tuned for how those programs will ultimately be implemented. And we look forward to sort of talking more about that progress in the near future. And then finally, while not directly an incentive, I do want to highlight some really exciting stuff out of the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law, which offered $74 million for enhanced geothermal system demos. Bill, as otherwise it has been fondly known, authorizes GTO to support an additional set of EGS pilot demonstration at a number of different geologic settings, as well as geographic locations across the United States. For example, we're looking for sites proximal to current geothermal project developers. So the traditional sort of hydrothermal resource, perhaps on the margins of those projects. Greenfield applications where there has been no prior geothermal development, as well as supercritical opportunities, as well as those in the eastern portions of the US. So the first rounds of full applications, the announcement was made in February. I believe letters of intent were due March 8th. And as you can see on the screen, first round applications are going to be due by June 16th. And we'll be doing this on a year-to-year basis between now and 2025 fiscal year. And we anticipate awards to be on the range of $5 to $25 million per project. So stay tuned for more information as we have it. One more thing I do want to talk about is, in addition to incentives, one of the other ways that we feel very strongly about from an advocacy standpoint is, in order to have people understand the benefits and the incentives to geothermal, you need to go out to communities and actually talk about what geothermal makes on offer from a benefit standpoint. And so we're really excited that we've been working with a number of communities across the states of Alaska and Hawaii over the past year to identify and build those types of relationships. And we're doing that with any number of stakeholders, from the consumer side, from the homeowner side, from the universities, as well as any number of other interested stakeholders, in order to understand what they care about, understand how geothermal can make a positive impact in their lives, and ultimately be responsive to the idea about how geothermal can meet decarbonization goals at that state, local, and regional level. We all know that the deployment angle of all of this is really going to be a very much a locally driven conversation. And so that's really the work that we're initiating in these states, and we're looking forward to expanding this effort to include many other states across the West, as well as more broadly. So with that, I think I will cede my time and turn it back to Steve, and thank you for the time.
Absolutely. And thank you, Sean, for joining us today. I will mention that our first workshop was held in Hawaii, and I can tell you they are very excited out there for the geothermal possibilities. Next up, we have Bryce Carter from the Colorado Energy Office. So we're now going from federal to state. And Bryce, I will just start our conversation off with, we know that the federal government can only do so much, and sometimes the state government needs to step in. Can you tell us a little bit about what Colorado is doing to encourage the deployment of geothermal resources in your state?
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. So I think when we look at the incentives that came from the wind and solar industry historically, we're in a similar spot where we were 10 to 15 years ago. The market is maturing, but there's opportunities for innovation and growth and economies of scale. So the question is, how can states like Colorado and elsewhere help facilitate the opportunity that the IRA and all these tax incentives can bring about? So Colorado has a history of leadership. Back in the day, we were actually one of the first states to implement a renewable portfolio standard to help set that policy track to take advantage of those incentives. And today we have goals going all the way up to 100% renewable electricity. So as we look at the roles of not only geothermal, but hydrogen and carbon capture, we see that we're in a similar opportunity of incentivizing those markets and really accelerating the adoption of these technologies. So today we are expecting new legislation to drop. So this is one of the first places you all will hear about this. But we're working on several critical policies to really accelerate and meet not only the needs of where we're seeing the federal incentives, but how can we spur development here in Colorado? So one of those incentives is that we are releasing a pretty large tax credit package, which includes $35 million that are being proposed for geothermal electricity generation projects. And these projects include addressing the exploration and development of wells, the drilling, exploration, and confirmation of wells, all the way to modifying existing oil and gas infrastructure to work with geothermal technology. And as part of our design, we want to be able to provide this funding on a merit basis. So assessing projects, say a 30% investment tax credit up to $1 million per company per year, but having an opportunity to bump that up to 50% if the project is going to demonstrate potential technology advancement or significant production of geothermal. In addition, we are going to be creating a production tax credit for geothermal electricity at 3 thousandths of a cent. So being able to help accelerate that element to provide that market clarity. Sean, I appreciate your slide of looking at the market and its evolution. And I think the trends that we see is how do you provide market clarity? And then how do you provide a reduction of the risk? And we know there's still risk when you're doing exploratory wells, especially as we're looking at advanced and enhanced geothermal systems. And while Colorado has a lot of potential, that we know that there's still opportunities to see what this technology can do. So that's where we are looking at facilitating these projects and looking at the leadership from the federal government, whether it's Forge or here in Colorado, we have the GLADE program, to really see what this technology can do and accelerate its adoption. Additionally, we are looking at other ways of being able to complement policies with the market. So we're looking at a clean firm standard. I know California has passed this, and so we're introducing legislation that's going to require utilities to look at a clean firm energy source to provide for on the grid. So as we see the variability of renewable energy technology, really, how do we get to that last 10% to make sure that we have base load supply? And obviously geothermal technology is going to be critical for that. So we're going to be having a percentage requirement for utilities of a specific size to have be able to meet the firm standard. So obviously that's a lot happening there. We also have our geothermal energy grant program that actually created my position, which is, I believe, one of the first in the country of a state role where it's specific to administering geothermal programming. And this legislation also allocates $12 million for not only electricity production projects, but also looking at single structured ground source systems and also thermal energy networks or geothermal exchange networks. And so we're really excited to also be offering a variety of tax credits related to ground source heat pumps and thermal energy networks, especially with those credits being additive as we look at developing the neighborhoods and communities in a network system. So currently we're looking and proposing a $3,000 per system credit for a ground source heat pump system. And then that's going to be additive for every unit that's connected to the system.
Bryce,
So
that's all great to hear. I wanted to take one step back really quickly because I know this is the first time people are going to be hearing about this bill that's going to be coming up in the Colorado legislature. Very exciting stuff coming from the governor's office in respect to geothermal. Do we have a timeline when that's going to drop? Is that the next week or a couple days, or what are we looking at there?
Ideally today, maybe tomorrow. So this is something we've been working on for many months to develop this program, looking at best practices happening across the state or across the country, and seeing what we can do in Colorado to take that leadership position.
That's awesome to hear. And I will say, you guys will probably go for our viewers today. Head over to Governor Porse's website. I guarantee they'll have a press release coming out with that. That's really exciting to hear. One thing I did want to ask about, Bryce, because this is something we actually got a question about. There is going to be a geothermal advisory board in Colorado. Could you give us an update? I know you guys have already closed the application period, but what is that board going to be doing? And what are they going to be looking at?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And really, we know with geothermal technology being an emerging market, things are going to shift around. We're going to have to be adaptable and understand how is the market responding. At the same time, we also want to make sure we're prioritizing how we shape these incentives, complementing the incentives that are coming from the federal government, thinking about how are we going to support disproportionately impacted communities, frontline communities in transition, and vulnerable communities, whether it's rural communities or mountain communities that might be experiencing limited capacity. So the Geothermal Advisory Group is essentially our eyes and ears for the industry and for communities, for utilities and other agencies to really come together and evaluate, are these policies going in the right direction, and help inform our strategy. I know in the presentation Sean provided, Colorado is shown to have a potential of 2 to 8 gigawatts of electricity capacity for geothermal. Personally, I would love to see us get to that 8 gigawatt level. So figuring out what pathway do we need to do to support that development is going to be really critical as we assess the effectiveness of all of these incentives that we're establishing and other policies, as well as just in community engagement. I mean, these incentives only go so far unless the community is part of those conversations, understanding what their role is in this, and making sure we're being inclusive as we design these programs, making sure that we're supporting local workforces and making sure folks are informed about what this technology can do.
Absolutely. And Bryce, I know that there's a lot of excitement around electricity generation right now, but our very first visit for this initiative was to Colorado Mesa University. There's some really exciting stuff going there around heating districts. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they plan to expand their system and how Colorado's government is helping them with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Colorado Mesa University is deploying essentially what's now become a thermal energy network, and that's the hot term going around the country. And it's a pipe system where buildings can exchange heat with one another and utilize the ambient temperature of the ground. So the more buildings that you're connected to this network, the more efficient the system is, utilizing heat pumps or ground source heat pumps in this case. And what's really exciting about this technology is that thermal energy networks, the potential is huge for decarbonizing our buildings and moving away from gas infrastructure. So there are a variety of pieces of legislation we're working on to help assist looking at promoting this technology. So helping Colorado Mesa University get to 100% with their thermal energy network, but also looking at other communities and new developments of how can we incentivize the market as well as really embrace this technology for what it has to offer. And that's part of where those tax credits for those thermal energy networks and the cumulative effect of ground source heat pumps, we want to be able to provide a clear glide path for that technology to come in for new developments, as well as begin to look at how do we renovate existing infrastructure. So one of the bills that we were looking at with thermal energy networks, and this one has been introduced, is requiring utilities, the largest utilities, to essentially pilot a couple projects to look at how does this technology work, and also prioritizing those communities I mentioned earlier, disproportionately impacted communities, as we look at deploying the technology.
All right, Bryson, one last quick question. You know, this is something that's come up in our initiative, but with that bill that's coming out here shortly, will some of those funds be able to be used for resource assessment and exploratory drilling? Because I know that is a huge cost to getting these geothermal projects going. Is there a portion in there for that?
Yes, so both with the geothermal grant program that we'll be facilitating, and our current timeline is hopefully July to be launching that. Applications can come in to help support resource assessment. And then similarly, as we're looking at projects to actually dig in the ground and figure out what the resources are, that's where some of those investments can be supported through the tax credit program. We are looking at holistically what data is out there and how we can provide more comprehensive mapping of what is available in Colorado. There's already a lot of data out there, both from existing oil and gas wells and other resources that can be consolidated to really provide an informed mapping of where not only the heat is, but also overlaying that data of understanding where transmission capacity is, where the demand is. So Colorado, like many states now, are experiencing retirements of fossil fuel facilities, coal power plants. And as those facilities go offline, it's going to be critical that we identify ways that we can meet capacity and create jobs in those communities. And so I think that's part of those conversations to come, figuring out how do we leverage, again, the federal incentives and the state incentives, and making sure those communities facing the biggest impacts are the ones that are going to get the benefit of this transition.
That is great to hear. Bryce, thank you very much for that update from Colorado. And to the folks viewing, make sure to go follow Governor Polis's press shop. It sounds like they're going to have a really exciting press release coming up here shortly. On to our next guest. I'd like to give the mic over to Landon Stevens from ClearPath Foundation. Landon, can you tell us a little bit about what ClearPath is and why you guys are so interested in geothermal?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen here really quick. But yeah, a little bit about myself and also about ClearPath. My name again is Landon Stevens. I manage our electricity portfolio at ClearPath. And while we work on geothermal, we work on a lot of other technologies as well. I think Bryce kind of labeled it well. We're focused primarily on kind of the clean, but also firm technologies. And so being an Arizona native myself, I live just outside of Phoenix. I'm glad to be here at the Western Governors Association and talking about this. But what we do at ClearPath, we're hoping that America can lead the world in addressing climate change. And the way that we want to do that is by developing innovative, market competitive, clean energy technologies, and then exporting those to the world. And we think that geothermal really has a role to play in that transition. So some of our top priorities, again, we work primarily at the federal level, but do some work on these technologies in state and regional issues. But we're working on the implementation of what we call the Big Four energy bills. So that would be the Energy Policy Act of 2020, the BIL, the IRA, and then also the CHIPS Act. So making sure that now that those are passed, how do we work on efficient implementation and getting steel in the ground and getting those resources out where they need to go. Long term, we want to continue to support federal energy innovation. And then a big policy area that we think has a role in this geothermal discussion as well, and I'll touch on it a little bit more later, but is enacting permitting reform. So that's a big priority for ClearPath. And then on the industrial side, we're looking at ways that our industrial sector can limit their emissions, both in operations and in materials produced. And finally, like I said, the goal ultimately is to export those around the world, increase trade, share best practices, and direct investment. So looking at a net zero future and what that possibly entails at ClearPath, we believe that there's no real silver bullet there, that it needs to be an all of the above approach with a good mix of technologies on the generation side, on the storage side, and on the carbon capture side. And obviously geothermal has a role there. So we focus on things like nuclear power, storage, as I mentioned, and then hydropower. And the 4 areas that we really put our efforts behind are supporting federal R&D, so funding at the base level of technologies getting off the ground, moving those into demonstration and pilot programs, which I'm sure Sean's group is a very key player in that part, and then deploying the incentives, which is what we're here to talk about today, kind of behind tax credits, public-private partnerships, those types of things. And then regulatory reform overall. What we are really aiming to do is set up an ecosystem where clean energy technologies of all types have a good shot to make it into the market and be successful, become more efficient and affordable. So ClearPath, we follow this idea of the S-curve, and I've mentioned pieces of this before, but the idea again is that ideas start out in the lab. We move on to the demo phase with some targeted pilot programs. A lot of times those will have some form of government support to get those in the ground. We work on refining policies to enable the technologies to make more headway. And then hopefully they reach a level where the costs come down. There's an efficiency of scale, economy of scale. And those are adopted into the marketplace. And then again, we take that one step further to go beyond just here in the United States, but to tackle the global emissions problem. And so we want to be able to export these technologies moving forward. One great historical example that we have of this is on the unconventional gas side of things. So looking at the gas industry, you had technologies like hydraulic fracturing or directional drilling around as far back as the 1970s. And a lot of those were, kind of refined in cooperation with government labs or government agencies. And then we combine those with other technological advances, horizontal drilling, diamond studded drill bits. All of these were learned over time through these kind of public-private partnerships. And then we could really catalyze that growth of an industry with some of these incentives. So for gas specifically, just over a 6 to 10 year window, we had around $10 billion in tax incentives that really launched that industry forward. And what we have today is the global leadership of the US in oil and gas exploration and production. And we think that with technologies like geothermal, obviously it's a great kind of analogy, being another drilling technology straight across the board, but we think that there's a lot of similarities, and this is kind of the pathway that we envision moving forward. So we're very appreciative to Sean, to groups like Colorado and Bryce being able to kind of look a little bit ahead and see the roadblocks that are preventing this mass adoption and trying to tackle some of those ahead of time. I won't touch too much on this. I think Sean did a great job kind of laying out exactly what's in the IRA as far as the PTC and the ITC options go. One thing I will point out, most kind of analysts and groups that we've talked to around this bill where the requirement says that the phase out will happen in 2032, or when we hit the emissions targets, whichever one comes later. Most people seem to think that that will occur well beyond 2032. So I think that for the most part, industry should feel pretty comfortable banking on at least a decade of this support being in place. So as they're planning for those projects, I think that's an important piece. Anytime you're dealing with an industry, having long-term investment certainty is very important. So I think this does a good job of that. So again, how does geothermal fit? I won't rehash too much what Sean said. He pointed out the numbers from the GeoVision report that we're looking at the potential of a 15x increase in installed capacity across the country. But again, that depends on, can we kind of speed up these milestones of hitting these economies of scale, lowering costs, finding efficiencies, and being able to overcome some of these regulatory hurdles. And that kind of brings me to my last slide here. The one area that I think I'll point out that ClearPath is also engaged in from a federal level is this idea of a categorical exclusion for geothermal. And so beyond the financial incentives and the support given there, we all know that if you get stuck in the red tape, nothing's going to get built. So it doesn't matter how much money you have if you can't get something permitted. And an interesting analogy, as I mentioned, talking about oil and gas, since 2005 in the Energy Policy Act, oil and gas has had these categorical exclusions from a lot of the NEPA requirements. And so it's very, I won't say easy, but it's a lot quicker to get an oil and gas drilling project off the ground, where geothermal, we're looking sometimes up to 7 to 10 years to get a project in service. And you can see here on this chart, it kind of shows all 6 of the different triggers where you could run into NEPA problems. And so one area that we're engaging, and we think it's very promising to see some movement on this, is getting a categorical exclusion for geothermal in the same way that oil and gas has it. We think that it can happen in a couple of different ways. It could happen administratively, just through the Department of Interior offering the same kind of guidance, or it could happen legislatively. And there has been some bills in the past that have aimed to do this. It just hasn't quite come together yet. But as we're talking about a broader permitting package that will probably have some kind of agreement with transmission regulation overhauls as well, I think there's a very real possibility that something like a federal categorical exclusion could be added for geothermal, which would really help open the gates to unlock the funding that we already have on the table, especially for use on public lands, on federal lands, which, as we know out west, is a majority oftentimes in many of our states. And so we're very optimistic about it. We think the IRA does a great job of kind of making those tax credits tech neutral, which we like to see, as opposed to gearing the award towards a technology. It's geared more towards an outcome, which is emissions reductions. And that should be kind of how we're crafting all of our policies moving forward. We think that's a good spot to be in. So again, thanks for having me. I'm glad to, help answer any questions as we go forward. So.
Absolutely. And Landon, thank you very much for joining us today. Just a reminder to the audience, if you would like to ask a question, we are moving into the Q&A portion of this webinar. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can enter a question there and I will ask our panelists it. I am going to start off with my own question, and this is going to be for Sean. Just on the theme of permitting, I know that there's currently an intergovernment working group that is looking at permitting. Is there anything you can share that group is working on, and any reports or anything that might come out of that?
Yeah, thanks. And Landon made a totally correct observation there about the sort of challenges associated with the it doesn't cost money, but the time value of money and the lack of financing, the challenges associated with taking 8 to 10 years to build a project from development to getting that first electron online really kills some of the project financing. In the permitting space, this is a subject that we've had a lot of great collaboration with our partners from the Department of Interior for a long time, actually thinking about this. It's not a new challenge. It's a resources question for an agency like the Interior. It's also an innovation space where we feel that right now, some work that we had was coordinated through the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the past year. We had a number of listening sessions and conversations with stakeholders from industry, from tribal organizations, as well as environmental NGOs, to fully understand the sort of opportunity to balance environmental stewardship while also streamlining the permitting opportunities associated with developing geothermal. There is a task force report out based on NREL's results. Steve, happy to share that link after the webinar here today, or if folks want to look it up, that's totally fine as well. The genesis of that work is resulting in a more focused working group level conversation among federal and state partners at states like Nevada, California, the Bureau of Land Management, and others from the Department of Interior standpoint, as well as DOE and GTO here. We are really thinking about this from an action-oriented standpoint. There are things, as Landon pointed out, that can be done legislatively. There are also best practices, for example, in implementing the Renewable Energy Coordination Office, which as an initiative is being stood up by the Bureau of Land Management, and will ideally be including geothermal as an explicit and sort of forward-leaning focus of that effort. That will hopefully provide BLM with resources, technical expertise, reaffirm their own technical expertise they already have in-house to be prolific at this work. And ideally, we and DOE are just very interested in helping to facilitate that conversation and move the conversation forward. So we're just kicking things off with the working group, but excited to sort of report out what we can in the future.
That's exciting to hear, and looking forward to seeing what comes of that. First question from our audience, and I will take this one. Mabel asks, is there an official map for energy communities? And I know that is going to be up to the U.S. Department of Treasury, and I believe they are currently working on that mapping. So there's a lot of people who are very excited to see what they come up with, but that will be done under the U.S. Department of Treasury for the working communities that was created under the IRA. The next question we have is for Sean as well, and is why the focus on Alaska and Hawaii? That was from Jordy. Sean, can you answer that question?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's one important aspect that is shared between communities like Hawaii and like Alaska, like other remote and islanded communities, are the challenges associated with getting consistent energy during times of need, whether it's because it's difficult to transport there, whether it's because the fuel prices associated with procuring that can be very expensive and unpredictable. DOE, through a number of initiatives, is looking at this from a multifaceted perspective. So we have department-wide programs thinking about this. How do we benefit remote and islanded communities more broadly? Much of that, though, hasn't included geothermal to date. But we know that Alaska has wonderful geothermal resources, largely unexplored and relatively data poor versus other parts of the US. But in addition to community engagement there, we also know Hawaii, Steve, as you mentioned, there's a lot of folks excited about the opportunity, and we know that there are already commercial operators in Hawaii doing great work there. So I think from a needs basis, it's largely focused initially on Alaska and Hawaii because of that remote islanded sort of focus. But we also know that there's going to be a large amount of benefit that as we continue through with that work, we'll be able to apply to any number of communities across the Western US.
Thank you, Sean. Now we have a viewer who asks, when will the $12 million grant program be taking applications? Bryce, you talked about this just a little bit, but can we get an overview of that grant program and who can apply and what can they apply for?
Yeah, great question. So the timeline, just so everyone knows, is intended to be July to release the funding. It's essentially 3 tiers of grants. One is the single structure grant program. We have the community geothermal grant program, and then we have the electricity level of production of the grant. And we'll be releasing the application process and eligibility criteria at that time. The intention essentially is contractors being able to support projects to move forward with adopting these technologies. So with a single structure grant program, a contractor can apply for up to 100 installations to receive amounts of, I believe it's about a maximum of $10,000 per property off of a geothermal system. And so there will be criteria that we will finalize in terms of that process. Similarly with the exchange network program, it's basically funding to help facilitate studies, whether you're doing initial greenhouse gas inventory, understanding what the impact would be. People can apply up to $100,000 for that, and then up to $500,000 for more of a technical evaluation study, or $500,000 toward actually building out a project. Similarly, for the electricity production side, to help do exploratory wells or actually build infrastructure, there is a 50% match up to $1 million, so $500,000. But the project incorporates hydrogen. And then there's a tweak that we're going through legislation right now to also include carbon capture technologies like direct air capture. The match would be 60%. So that's it would be $600,000. There is information, I can share the link regarding our program that's based off of legislation. And then again, the actual application process and criteria will be released, hopefully July or at least mid to late summer.
Thank you, Bryce. Our next question describes a geothermal site next to a WAPA transmission line. I believe that is the Western Authority or Western Area Power Authority. And the question is, can we expedite the NEPA requirements with WAPA using a categorical exclusion? Landon, I think that's on the other side of the NEPA process that you were describing. Is that the categorical, would a categorical exclusion help with connecting to a transmission line, or is that something else that we might be looking at there?
I mean, I think that would be something else. I guess you could, if somebody wanted to, I guess they could do a categorical exclusion for transmission planning as well. But this is more talking about the actual drilling site process. So with oil and gas, it's more of, drilling the wells and those types of projects, which we think has a very good correlation to geothermal. It's almost an identical process. So, we don't see any reason why they wouldn't be given the same kind of incentives that oil and gas would, especially with the emissions profile that geothermal has. Transmission's a whole other beast, and there will be a whole bunch of different discussions about what those policies look like. But I don't imagine it would be a categorical exclusion. That would be pretty novel, but I guess it could take that form. So.
Absolutely. And I'll say there's been a lot of discussion lately in regards to staffing levels in some agencies to make sure that these processes go forward smoothly in a timely manner. So that's another consideration for the NEPA process too. Our next question, and you touched on this, Landon, somebody asked, one of the biggest issues in Western Colorado is drilling costs. Is there a plan to decrease costs or improving drilling efficiency for a closed loop system? So obviously I think a CADX would help with that. But also, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Glade project in Colorado is currently trying to see how we can make it more cost efficient to drill a closed loop system. Is that correct, Bryce?
Yeah, so Glade is a federally funded project to support testing out drilling technologies. I know the School of Mines and other universities are part of that program to really see what it takes. And that's where I think it's a bit of the technology, it's a bit of understanding or incentivizing these types of projects. And I know one thing I didn't mention earlier is that Colorado, we are working at streamlining regulations to understand, what are the bottlenecks and ways that we can support that. I know the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, as well as the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, are working on legislation to help figure out how we can make it easier for those types of projects to get off the ground. And our office has provided comments regarding categorical exclusions as we're evaluating NEPA. So I think all this is definitely where we see a role to help facilitate that on the state side, but obviously there's still the federal connections depending on the type of land we're working on.
Sean, looks like you have something to contribute to that.
Yeah, I think, GTO is excited to fund Glade and as part of our drilling demonstrations, POA from last year, our hydrothermal resources program has been doing amazing work at sort of supporting. I just want to talk a little bit about sort of, the broader innovation space for drilling. It's not only a matter of cutting down, either increasing your rate of penetration. It's also, reducing non-productive time when you have a rig on site. And another really important way that projects like Forge and others have really demonstrated this is by physics-based approaches for drilling. So no longer relying on sort of the analog approaches of the past sort of practices in our industry, and really updating and benefiting from awareness and opportunity from oil and gas and others that we're sort of bringing over and directly providing practitioning for. As an example, one of the most recent Forge wells was drilled 60 days ahead of schedule within a solid granitic pluton in Utah. And so that's by best practices alone in collaboration with a number of amazing folks from academia, as well as our national labs. And so we have the ability to innovate in that space right now. We're doing that in the technology space as well as the best practices.
So Sean, I will also interject one of my own questions here. In our workshops, we've had a lot of discussions about either a cost share or an insurance program for exploratory drilling. Has there been any talk at the federal level about that? I know that it's happened in the past. Is there anything that's come up recently?
Not recently. You're right, Steve, that at various points in the past, DOE has certainly supported that. I think you're also seeing internationally, that's a very popular model in the EU and the African continent and others that are sort of seeing that as an important risk management tool. So yeah, certainly something that we are keeping our eye on, but not something that current practice for us.
Wonderful. Next question, it says, is geothermal considered a proven technology due to the dependency on the resource hot water / steam existing when drilling? I think I might be able to give some context there. It's considered a proven technology largely due to the improvements that DOE's or the research and development that DOE has done at Utah Forge to develop EGS systems. Sean, can you give us a little background on what they did at Forge and how they've proven an EGS system?
Sure. I want to start by saying, right, so hydrothermal, as a geothermal technology class, is one of the old guard of the renewables world, along with hydropower, along with others. So it's well proven and well known for us how to access the hydrothermal space. The EGS space represents that kind of next generation. So the comment was sort of talking about you need a confluence of water, porosity, permeability, and heat in order to all sort of manifest a traditional system. Well, EGS is the idea that you can tap stranded heat in a much more broad geographic opportunity and create a man-made reservoir and engineer that reservoir to mimic the way nature would through a diffuse fracture network. So by engineering your system, that is the type of goal at projects like Forge. We are looking to create a practicable approach that can be replicated in any number of basins across the United States. And so that's the really exciting part, that Forge is doing amazing things. I will put a link in the chat for Forge in case anybody is interested in learning more. But suffice to say, it's a world-class site, and we're really excited to support it.
Bryce?
Yeah, I just want to add, in the Colorado context, Forge is really exciting because it has very high temperature resources close to the surface. And so it's the perfect kind of playground to experiment with technologies and to see what's effective. Glade is much more, how do we get to depth based on the evolution of technology? And I feel like right now is the right moment where technology advancements in the oil and gas industry have led us to a point where we can get to the depths where we have higher heat that we see in Utah, in places like Colorado at that deeper depth. And one of my graphs that I show, and I'll just do a quick screen share to give context, is you can see this is our heat map in Colorado based with our existing 6,000 foot level. The average oil and gas well in Colorado is about 6,800. So you see there's a few pockets where we might be able to get low to maybe even some high temperature wells. But once you start having enhanced and advanced geothermal systems, the map looks like this at 10,000 feet. So this is why there's essentially a gold rush for geothermal coming out as these technologies are demonstrated, because there's such a huge potential of utilizing these resources.
That is really exciting, Bryce. Thank you for sharing that. the last question we're going to have time to answer, and I won't be able to ask the full question, but Landon, Scott wanted to know, could you go over the big four energy bills again, and also elaborate how they might work in tandem with each other?
Yeah. So the big four were the BIL that was mentioned, the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Energy Policy Act of 2020, and then also the CHIPS Act. So, I mean, in the geothermal context, really the biggest kind of interplay between them is the different funding options right now. Obviously, it's outlaying hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars for different clean energy technologies, and geothermal fits into a lot of those. So, I mean, there's so many different programs that I guess, you could drill down into. I was just talking to a group the other day about how we really almost need some like federal funding Sherpas now to help companies and industries navigate all the different options, especially when you add on the different adders that we were talking about for the PTC and the ITC. The planning process becomes very complex to maximize, which is good in that it can change the economics completely of a project and help get things online, but there is an element of complexity there. So I think funding is the biggest thing. Again, I just can't reiterate enough, if we don't see some kind of change on the permitting side, as it relates to not only geothermal drilling, but transmission planning, infrastructure build out, just permitting in general. I mean, I don't want to say it's all for naught, but it's going to be very hard to reach the types of goals that I think we all are envisioning here. So there's more to do, but those are the big four that we feel like the dollars have been allocated. Now it's how do we talk to states and local communities on getting those resources in the right place at the right time to be most efficient. And it sounds like, I'll give a lot of credit to Bryce and Colorado. It sounds like they're well ahead of the curve thinking about how can states maximize that. I know I've had conversations with officials in Arizona, at the Arizona Power Authority and different organizations who are thinking along these same lines, and how do we collaborate to make sure the states are really seeing the impact and being part of these solutions. So.
Thank you, Landon. And I know that there are more questions that we were not able to get to, but I do want to be considerate of our participants' time today. As a reminder to all our viewers, the initiative, the Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative, will conclude in June with the release of the Heat Beneath Our Feet initiative report. This will be accompanied with WGA's annual meeting that will be held in Boulder, Colorado on June 26th through the 28th. And I hope to see many of you from the geothermal community there. Thank you very much for our participants. Once again, Landon, Bryce, and Sean, thank you very much. And as a reminder, the work WGA has been doing would not be possible without the contributions from our sponsors, and we're very grateful for their support. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll see you on the next Heat Beneath Our Feet webinar.